Thank you guys. I think sustainability is an area where I can so passionate and I can talk a lot actually. Let's hope in the next 30 minutes, it's about 18 minutes or so, how I can summarize some of the big picture stuff which is happening. Because honestly, I think what's happening at this point of time is that with BRSR coming up now, with the top 1,000 market cap companies being required to sort of report the various parameters that SEBI has prescribed, it is now beginning to catch attention in a serious note. And I think this is only going to get more difficult. And of course, the government of India has talked about net zero by 2070, and organizations are doing a number of different things actually. So what I'll try to do is to give you some perspective in terms of what's happening in the world of ESG. And I think each organization will have to work its own way in terms of how do they progress on that path. Because ESG is not just a matter of compliance actually. ESG is becoming a matter of strategy, and for a number of companies, ESG is a matter of purpose actually. So I'll try to make it anecdotal, I'll try to give examples to sort of give this message forward. I think, as all of us know, the whole genesis in terms of ESG or the lack of ESG began with the Milton Friedman doctrine, the Chicago School, who basically said that profit maximization, shareholder wealth maximization was the only thing that mattered actually. And for over many, many years, that was the only thing which mattered. So if you delivered profits to shareholders, that was great. And anything else was kind of seen as noise or secondary actually. However, events changed. I think events changed around the time that Arthur Andersen collapsed in 2001. ESG suddenly became focus. And when Lehman crisis happened, impact on other stakeholders also started to become a very important part of it. But the reality is that while Milton Friedman and this doctrine of profit maximization and shareholder wealth maximization may have been a very American Chicago School concept which came in the 60s actually, there are many organizations in the world which have not followed this for years before that actually. I think that's the truth. And I think for us in the Tata Group, the inspiration has always been Mr. Tata, Jamshedji Tata, who said way back in 1900s, saying that the enterprise exists for the sake of the community. It cannot be anything else actually. So the community was always at the center of everything. And that is the philosophy with which Tata have been running the businesses over the last 120 years or so. And we are not the only exception. There are some great organizations around the world which do that. And one organization that I've always been very inspired with is Patagonia. Patagonia is an American company which makes those beautiful jackets actually in the clothing wear actually. And what they say, 50th year, Yvonne Chouinard says that for our 50th year, we're looking forward, not back, to life on earth. Imagine describing a business as protecting life on earth actually. I think that's amazing actually. And together, let's prioritize purpose over profit. I think that's a very fundamental statement. Let's prioritize purpose over profit and protect this wondrous planet, our only home actually. That's a completely different perspective, and of course somewhat similar to what Mr. Tata said in terms of community at the stakeholder. In fact, some of the things that Patagonia has done is quite amazing actually. As an example, when Trump reduced corporate taxes in the US, corporates were all very happy that corporate taxes got reduced by 10%. And Patagonia said, sorry, we don't deserve that 10% decrease. It is a fair share of taxes that we have to pay. And so whatever Trump has reduced in terms of taxes, they put aside in a fund for environmental protection actually. And that is just the attitude that they had. And more recently, about 6 months ago, what Yvonne Chouinard did was to convert his entire company by retaining just 2% and transferring 98% to a non-profit actually. And therefore he's basically saying all profits go to the non-profits, and the non-profit will work on conservation and on the earth. This is what happens in the Tata Group. Tata Trust, which is the ultimate parent company of Tata Sons, has about 65%, which means all companies' profit consolidates and dividends into Tata Sons, and Tata Sons' dividend 66% goes to Tata Trust, and that goes for various community-based activities actually. So these are some fantastic examples where I think society, the environment, the communities are the heart of the way business is done actually. And these are exceptional examples in terms of how purpose comes above anything else actually. Now, Now it is not just these companies. In fact, one of the biggest seminal changes which happened with BlackRock in 2019. The Larry Fink, BlackRock, as you know, is the biggest asset manager in the world, with more than 10 trillion, 9 or 10 trillion dollars in terms of assets under management actually. And he wrote this famous letter to share to companies, CEOs. Every year he writes this letter to CEOs, and he said we have to manage the long term, and we cannot manage the long term without embracing purpose and considering the needs of a broad set of shareholders actually. Now this is, and Larry Fink saying it is so important. Now mutual funds are of two types. One is active funds, like what we put our monies into an ICICI Prudential or whatever, or passive funds, which are index funds. As you know, passive funds don't actively manage, they follow indices. Most of the money in Larry Fink's case, in BlackRock's case, is all passive funds actually, which means they don't actively manage. And the reason that model is successful is because the asset management costs are much lower. Like if you invest in an index fund in India, the commissions that you charge are very low. It's a passive fund. That means they don't really meet companies all the time. And yet he said, even as a passive fund, that other stakeholders' profits had to be managed actually. So and this has set off a whole range of reactions in the US, especially in the US actually, where they say ESG is all woke. And there has been a lot of controversy around whether funds which invest people's monies should consider ESG factors into reckoning or not actually. But this is not going to die down actually. This is not going to die down. Florida has been the latest in terms of banning pension funds from investing into companies using ESG as a factor. So Florida has basically said that you cannot use ESG as a factor, and there's a lot of pushback on that, saying that that's not necessarily true. And I think, of course, there is one fundamental challenge with ESG funds which is not proven, is that if you follow a sustainable investment strategy, are you guaranteed superior returns? That is not yet proven actually. And when in an environment where that is not proven, it becomes hard for companies, investment managers to say that ESG will give you a better strategy. The only thing is that on a long-term basis, if you don't have a business to run, you have nothing to show actually. And I think therefore long-term it makes sense. And why is this pressure coming? I think a lot of the pressure is, I come back, before I go there, I come back to the stance on sustainability. So the question that all of you have to ask yourself, is your company's stance driven by compliance? Which means that SEBI has mandated BRSR, so I will comply. That is a stance driven, very narrow focus based on compliance. Is your stance driven by strategy, which means genuinely it makes a difference in terms of my business model and the value addition and value creation that I can do. Therefore, is your ESG stance strategy, or as we have seen in Tata's and Patagonia's, is your ESG stance a purpose actually? Now, depending upon what your stance is, how you work completely changes. If your stance is compliance, which is what most companies it is happening, the company secretary will be filling in the BRSR form, the finance guys will be giving some data, other departments will be giving the data, it's compliance actually. If your stance is strategy, then you will find that different business heads will be kind of working on ESG related strategies on procurement or on operations and things like that. If it is purpose, it's right up the board level, and it is right down to every person in the organization who has an ESG KPI actually. I think so, depending upon what your stance is, the ways of working can be completely different actually. And this clarification of stance is very important. Not everybody is going to be at the stage of purpose actually. Not everybody is. And wouldn't blame that if everybody is not at the stage of purpose. But to stay at the compliance end is just not going to be enough actually. You will have to do something around the business model strategy piece. So I think most companies will gravitate to using ESG as a strategy, not necessarily as purpose actually. Now, if you go to some of the drivers as to why this is happening, I think clearly climate change is a very big part of it actually. Climate change is a very big part of it, and this whole imperative of the 1.5 degree imperative, it's very critical. In fact, I think you have seen the latest, IPCC report 6 which has come in, which fundamentally says that we are not doing enough in terms of meeting the 1.5 degree imperative of by 2050. And therefore the world is going to get tougher, and all the impacts that you see in terms of storms and floods and all that. In fact, to be honest, most of us in the room will probably not realize the impact, except, I do not know, some of you may have realized, as you started renewing your insurance premiums for your corporation as on March 31st, your insurance premiums have been going up actually. Especially the NatCat premiums, the natural catastrophe premiums in terms of fires and floods and all that. I can tell you in my own company's case, when we were doing our NatCat renewals this year, one of the prominent reinsurers in India, GIC, did not want to reinsure actually. So we had to find another insurance thing. Premiums are going up actually. And premiums going up are the very first signs that you start seeing in terms of climate change impact. The other impact which you see, the floods in Bombay, 2005, the floods in Chennai, 2015. Now the recent, challenge in, which is at play, Joshimath, where you had subsidence and these are all impacts of climate change. And how does it impact you? If you are a company operating in Chennai in 2005 and you had facilities in Chennai, your facilities were impacted actually. Your facilities were impacted, and if you have not just that, I think the previous speaker alluded to supply chain resilience. It not just you were impacted, your vendors were also impacted actually. And therefore your supply chain resilience is impacted, and hence business continuity is impacted actually. So this is how people are beginning to feel climate change impacts come in. On the agricultural side, crops have been impacted. In fact, there's a very scary study which says that the world probably has got 50 more harvests, not more. Can you believe it? Can you look at the statement to say that the world has probably got 50 more harvests, which is 50 years of agricultural production. Beyond it, the climate is going to get so bad that you're not going to be able to produce food. And what happens to the billions who are going to be there? That's where innovation comes in terms of different forms of thing and the focus on regenerative agriculture and all of that actually. But climate change is a real factor, guys. And I think it's affecting everybody actually. It's very insidious and it is not always apparent immediately. You will have to constantly watch and scan to make sure where it impacts you actually. Emissions, and I think fundamentally, I think what BRSR and all of it is doing is to understand emissions. In fact, ESG, environment, social and governance, when you talk about, I think there was an article in The Economist which says, let's forget about social and governance for a minute. I'm not saying that's not important. Let's just focus on the E, environment, and within that, let's just focus on emissions. I think Economist was very, very hard hitting to sort of say, let's focus on emissions. And it's a real problem. Even coming from my office to here in a car, in a diesel car or a petrol car is emissions actually. Standing here and using these facilities, and if that electricity which powers the bulb and all that we are doing comes from energy sources which are gas based, which are coal based or petroleum based, is also emissions actually. So I think understanding scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions and what do you do to control it is very critical. What is scope 1 is very simple. Scope 1 is what you do in your own operation. So if this is a hotel or this is a factory, whatever happens in this hotel, whatever happens in this factory, and the emissions which get generated is scope 1. What is scope 2? Scope 2 is the power that you buy. If I generate power with my genset, it is scope 2. If I generate power with a solar panel, it is scope 2. But if I buy power from MSEB, that is scope 2 actually. So sorry, if I generate power, it is scope 1. But if I buy power from MSEB, it is scope 2. Now the question is, can I go green power actually? Now fortunately, there are options in terms of green power. And when you talk of scope 2 reduction, it is not just what you buy, it's also what you consume. Which means that if you've got electronic, IoT based scanners which sort of say that if you walk out of the room the lights go down and kind of other measures like that, and there are several such innovations which are happening, that also enables you to manage scope 3. Scope 3 is the most difficult. Scope 3 is really fundamentally your supply chain and your customers. So for a hotel business like mine, my vendor ecosystem in terms of their emissions is my problem, and my customers who come and stay in my hotel, they're also scope 3. I may have these beautiful safaris where people fly from long distances and enjoy a vacation. But the fact that they flew by a plane and took a car and stayed there is also scope 3 actually. So the question is that, and companies are expected to measure, report and do something about scope 1, scope 2 and scope 3. Scope 3 is the hardest. And so really speaking, companies have to decide which is their biggest part of their emissions and start taking actions actually. I think that is what is the implication in terms of emissions actually. So now I think I just want to highlight two aspects, which is all these net zero pledges that companies are doing actually. Net zero pledges, is it realistic? Is it possible? I think everybody realizes that, if you look at all the announcements which are happening, they're all talking about net zero pledges being taken by corporations actually. The thing to understand about net zero pledges is that it's good to have. That is because what has been required is world has to come to, like India has announced net zero by 2070. People are saying by 2050, if you need to get to 1.5 degrees temperature change, you need to sort of go for a net zero kind of a thing. But the problem is net zero compliance You can't achieve net zero by yourself. There are ecosystem dependencies. What do I mean by that? In Taj Kolaba, which is our flagship property, we signed up with Tata Power for a green power actually, and that's a comprehensive arrangement. But because there are load changes and also battery storage, because solar power depends on ability to store. You generate during the daytime and you have to store at the night time. Because Tata Power doesn't have those things, they are able to guarantee only 70% green power actually. So therefore the balance 30%, even if I want to be green net zero in Taj Kolaba, I won't be, because the ecosystem dependency can only allow me 70% actually. So what I have done in Taj Kolaba is that I bought something called an international renewable energy certificate from another power company and bought the green attribution and said Tata Power is, Taj Kolaba is 100% green. But in reality it is not. It is only 70% green because the ecosystem only delivers to me 70%. Therefore, when you hear conversations around net zero for your companies, I think a better target, right? Net zero is philosophically 2050. I think it is better to define decarbonization targets. What do I do in terms of decarbonizing my value chain, in terms of how I operate, so that I start reducing the emissions. So there you can say 2030 targets, 2025 targets, and move towards it. And over a period of time, net zero. Net zero is also being criticized because 2050 target liya to I won't be there, my boss will not be there, none of us will be there. I think that's also been one big criticism which is there. But decarbonization is really what companies have to focus on actually. And understanding physical assets, I think there are two things here. One is the transition risk and the second is the physical risk. Transition risk is nothing but the risk of reducing your emissions. What do you do in terms of decarbonization? That is transition risk. Physical risk is nothing but what happened in Chennai floods as an example. Water levels rising, your assets being completely put out of use actually. Example, in Europe, regulations are saying coal cannot be used. So in fact, there have been lawsuits in Europe which say that, guys, you are investing in a coal-based plant in Poland, but European regulations won't permit. So your investment of say $300 billion will be completely unutilizable. So there's a concept of stranded assets, which means that you're not able to use the assets, and therefore this stranded asset concept is real actually. There are so many places in the world where assets are going to get stranded. In fact, the risk, and what does it mean as finance people actually? The asset values that many of the companies are carrying on their balance sheet are probably going to get worthless because of climate change announcements. In fact, in the UK, there was a particular region in the UK, this was last year's information, where UK announced that one particular region was getting impacted by floods actually, and they said it is unsafe. The moment they called it out officially, none of those properties were saleable. None of those properties were insurable. People had loans and those property values are zero actually. So one of the biggest implications from is your balance sheet values that are going to carry are useless actually. And if they say that 2050 there will be a flood, when you do projections, you take terminal values, Your terminal values are based on perpetuity from the 10th year. Perpetuities you cannot do. And normally if you see valuations, perpetuity values can be 60% of the value of what you're trying to buy. If perpetuities are going to go away, then your fundamental values are going to go down actually. So the implications of climate change on balance sheets is real. In fact, IFRS is now working in terms of asking companies in the next 3-4 years to start incorporating climate risks into the financial statements in terms of provisions actually. So this is one of the biggest implications which is coming actually, which is absolutely coming, and International Sustainability Standards Board is working on it. And I think regulation clearly is pushing for disclosure. I think what is happening with BRSR, SEC, there's a lot of disclosure which is being pushed. And the moment disclosures happen, when 1,000 companies report their BRSR as of 31st of March, the amount of data that the regulators are going to get is going to be very, very significant actually. And what comes out, you will get insights out of that data in terms of where the companies are, in terms of various emissions and other factors actually. And then we'll have to see what regulators do. And they will say, do this, do this, do this, do this. It's going to push. So disclosure is only the starting point actually in terms of further action. So it is something that is, and if you're not a top 1,000 company, you can't escape, because they are bringing it to top 250 companies. And it will change, it will completely change. Vendor related disclosures they're asking you to do. They're asking, you can't outsource. You cannot outsource your risk. You can't say, I will be compliant, but I'll push my dirty process onto my vendor ecosystem. Sorry, That is scope 3. So you have to sort of monitor actually. And one of the biggest business model changes which is happening in Europe is something called CBAM actually. Cross-border, management. What they are trying to do in this mechanism is that if you are importing steel from Europe, if Europe is importing steel from India, and Indian steel content has got high carbon, they are saying that we will charge a carbon tax actually. And that carbon, because they are saying, and India is now protesting in GATT, saying that it is an anti-trade measure. Europe is saying no. If you are a steel producer with a lower amount of carbon than him, then he will be charged more in terms of the carbon tax than you. So it has nothing to do with trying to minimize imports. It's about reducing the carbon intensity actually. And therefore steel companies, aluminum companies, and all of the people who are exporting to Europe are all investing in terms of making sure that they decarbonize, because this carbon tax is apparently equivalent to 25% of your cost of product actually. Imagine paying 25% of cost of product in terms of doing it. So you're better off in investing in green technologies and avoiding that 25% actually. So it is forcing business model changes to make that happen actually. And I think if you go, some of the other key sustainability issues, it's not just climate change, because ESG is such a big thing, and that is where people get confused, but that's also important in terms of how it is getting focused on. Some of the issues are supply chain resilience. We spoke about it in terms of how do you ensure that your supply chain is resilient in terms of being able to take the shocks actually, and hence working on supply chain becomes important. COVID showed, what happened, the entire inflation that the world has seen is because of supply chain related challenges, because China's supply didn't work actually. So supply chain resilience is becoming an extremely important factor. The second thing is human rights. Rana Plaza, I think there was an episode, German regulation where child labor was used. Rana Plaza was a classic case in Bangladesh where forced labor in a building which collapsed actually. So you had sweatshops where, you may be a Walmart trying to buy cheap clothes from Bangladesh. If you're selling to your customer a t-shirt at $2, imagine what you can afford to pay the Bangladeshi guy in terms of from whom you're buying t-shirts. And if he has to supply to you a t-shirt at 50 cents, how much will he pay his employees actually? And if those working conditions are not right, then you're liable actually. And these are very big implications. There are fiduciary responsibilities on directors actually. Directors are getting sued. Shell directors were recently sued saying that they are not doing enough to decarbonize actually. I think so this is happening. Diversity, equity, inclusion. I think this is becoming a very important thing. For instance, I think one of the areas is artificial intelligence, facial recognition. So there has been a case in the US where because facial recognition attributes determined that a white is better for a job than a black. And therefore they say ethics of AI. How can you let AI decide that the white person is better than a black person or vice versa? And then they got into how do you write that AI? And they said that bias in AI is coming because the way AI is programmed is by humans. If I'm programming the AI and my biases go into the AI actually. So AI ethics is becoming very important. Explainability is very important. Part of the problem with machine learning and artificial intelligence, when you do deep learning kind of algorithms and all that, you don't know how exactly the computer, ChatGPT or others are coming to conclusions actually. You don't have line of sight. And therefore, regulators are now pushing for explainability of decisions taken by AI actually. So diversity, equity, inclusion is becoming very, very critical. Bribery and anti-corruption is becoming a very important case. You can't kind of get business by bribing. That's always been there, anti-bribery law. But it's getting even more importance under the ESG umbrella actually. Data, cyber security, privacy, we spoke about actually. I think that's very, very responsible. AI is really a big area at a board level. Tax transparency. Companies are publishing, Indian companies are publishing tax transparency reports. You see Tata Steel as an example. They publish a full section on tax transparency reports saying that they are paying their fair share of taxes. It is not a question of tax avoidance is no longer kind of a good word. You need to be able to say that I'm paying my fair share of taxes actually. And in tax transparency reports, companies are actually saying, this is how I have my tax governance. These are the taxes I'm paying. And I'm not shortchanging anybody actually. So fair share of taxes is now a very, very important part of sustainability actually. Executive compensation is getting linked actually, which means that if there are BlackRock and others are now saying that if you do not have ESG metrics complied with, you will not get the bonuses. Proxy voting, they can reject your salary thing actually. Now just a couple of other things, understanding materiality is at the heart of it. So ESG is a very big area. So one of the things that you need to understand is materiality. So for your respective industry, materiality could be energy, In respect to energy, it could be labor. Some other industry, it could be something else actually. One useful thing, if you don't know how to do your materiality, kindly look at SASB. SASB is the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. I mean, I don't know the full expansion, but SASB has industry-specific materiality issues actually. You can use that as a quick understanding of what your material issues are and relate to your own company actually. That's the starting point, because once you know what your material issues are, then you can sort of start acting on it. Like if I say that power is the biggest material issue for me in terms of scope 2 emissions, then I can do something about power. So we need to find out what your materiality assessment is. Then a couple of other things very quickly. Investor concerns is becoming very important, because I think Larry Fink letter we spoke about, and I think pension funds are putting pressure. I think the real genesis is coming from pension funds. Many of you would have taken policies with HDFC Life or ICICI Pru or SBI Life, which says I will pay you pension from your age of 60 to year 99 actually. That's what they say. A lot of the policies kind of say that, and many of us have taken, I've taken it myself, because it's a good way of getting an annuity actually. And HDFC Life invests on your behalf in different companies. If those companies don't exist, then where is their ability to give you pensions actually? And therefore, what happens today, you're working, you're earning. In your post-retirement years, when you're not earning, you're dependent on that pension for your livelihood actually. And if the pension fund is not able to give you that earning, that is why the whole pressure from an asset manager perspective is coming from pension funds, where they're saying, guys, when you invest as a mutual fund, and I'm putting money in you, giving you the money to sort of invest into different companies, make sure you consider ESG factors actually. So the whole pressure is actually coming from pension funds, and that's where the rise of ESG funds is happening actually. And sorry, something happened. Yeah, investing styles are becoming different. I think normally we are used to traditional investing styles, conventional investing, but now there is something called an engagement investing actually. Engagement investing or active ownership principles actually. What does active ownership principles basically mean? It basically means, so investing styles are of two types. I can say that I am a mutual fund, I will not invest anything in gambling. That is called exclusionary investment, which is fine. But when it comes to oil and gas and coal, what mutual funds are saying is that it doesn't make sense to have exclusionary investment strategies which says I will not invest in oil and gas. I'm better off being invested in oil and gas and using my shareholder power to make changes, to force them to make changes. One of the biggest examples is ExxonMobil last year, where a hedge fund kind of made changes to the board. ExxonMobil never thought that their board member nominations would be lost actually, but ExxonMobil lost. And hedge fund was able to put 3 directors on the board of ExxonMobil, which means they continued to be a shareholder of ExxonMobil. They put 3 directors who were seen as proactive in terms of making changes to ExxonMobil strategies actually. So the engagement strategy is becoming a very, very important thing. And if you look at many of the mutual funds reports actually, they will actually tell you that these are the matters on which I will vote for, these are the matters in which I will vote against actually. And they also give you statistics on how they vote actually. So it's becoming very important from a CFO who deals with investors, because if you will not be able to get an investor and you will not be able to get them to vote if you don't follow those principles actually. And they're very transparent about it. And proxy voting, of course, we just discussed. I think green finance, I think ultimately, I think a lot of us are now raising monies actually. If you're raising green finance, in fact, if you're raising any form of finance for project purposes from the capital market, bear in mind that investors are now going to ask you about your green credentials actually. It is coming. It is coming. It is no longer something that you can avoid. Investors are increasingly saying that I want to understand your green credentials actually. So ultimately, I think this is something that there is no choice, guys. It is not about compliance. It is about strategy actually. And ultimately what all this does is to build resilience. It is physical resilience, which means that if you're in a coastal town, can you assess the physical risk of sea level rise and then say, I have taken these steps to invest, and therefore when a storm hits, my assets are protected and therefore my business continuity happens. I think that is the gold standard in terms of physical assets resilience. The second one is financial resilience. Obviously, you need to protect earnings. If you don't, then your earnings are not protected. Business model pivots. One of the greatest examples is a company called Ørsted. It was in coal mining, coal-related power in Netherlands actually. It completely pivoted to wind. And it told the shareholders, I'm changing. And one of the biggest challenges in ESG is that when you make those pivots, I think the question is your return profile is what? Short-term versus long-term becomes important. Ørsted is a great example. It said it's going to take time, But I'm going to pivot because I can't survive as a coal power. And in 15 years, it's one of the darlings in the stock market in terms of shareholder returns, actually. So business model pivots are becoming important. Building regulatory resilience is very critical. I think this is an example of how state oil, there is methane emissions which happen from oil and gas extraction. Carbon tax imposed by Norway. State oil actually invested into processes and their methane emission is the minimal actually, which means regulatory compliance becomes important. Resilience. And then building reputational resilience. I think that's very critical. It is not that you're building resilience only to protect your bottom line and things like that. If you don't do, you will stand out as a company which is not kind of complying. So therefore, reputational resilience is going to be very, very important, guys. So I think this is such a massive subject, actually. We can talk for hours. But the point is that I think it's an area where CFOs have a huge role to play. Today, I think because it's become compliance, you find sometimes the chief sustainability officers are doing it, company secretaries are doing it, HR departments are doing it, actually. But eventually, it has to move to the financial CFOs, actually. Because what really is happening is that when you do an integrated report, today as a CFO, I sign a CEO CFO's certification. Can I say that I'm certifying the financial side of my integrated report, but I'm not certifying the non-financial side of the integrated report? And there are crossovers, actually. So this is coming. So I think, so this is a huge implication for CFOs, and CFOs are best placed to drive it. I think all the best, guys. Thank you.